I have been talking about the 3DS and the Vita for years now, and something I've talked about, at least in some of my older videos, is the value of the PS Vita was never really there on the used market, because at least in years past, it cost about $200, $250 for your average PS Vita, maybe a little bit less for a Japanese imported model. But nowadays, I've been seeing them for around $100 to $120, which is honestly an amazing price, and really does change the value proposition of the Vita. On top of having an amazing first-party library, the amount of things you can do with a PS Vita is astonishing. There's a whack ton of emulators, there's PS Vita ports that have been made for games like Sonic Mania, and even Android ports for some of the most popular games of that era, like Call of Duty Zombies. And all those ports use the native controllers on the Vita, it doesn't use the touchscreen whatsoever. So the Vita has actually aged remarkably well in comparison to some other handhelds out there. Originally, in my older videos, in one of the first videos I ever made on the channel, my biggest complaint about the Vita is how cost prohibitive it was for most people to consider, mainly because the thing cost almost $300, especially if you bought one off of Amazon, which usually would end up being a Japanese import. That could be almost $400 back in those days. But now, honestly, you can get them for a pretty solid price, like I mentioned, anywhere between $100 and $120. That has drastically improved the availability and people being able to actually buy this thing. For my personal PS Vita, I use these grips that I found off of Amazon many years ago at this point, which they go by so many different names at this point, I don't really care. I originally wanted the Hori sort of grip thing for the Vita, but that is incredibly expensive to get your hands on. And there's one by Nyko, but it plugs directly into the charging port, which I'm not entirely comfortable doing that with these little grip add-ons, mainly because of my experiences with Nintendo Switch stuff, because that has so many problem areas in potential red flags that it's just sort of given me the aversion to anything third party that plugs into the charging port and messes with how you charge the device. There's a great deal of things you could do with your Vita, and on my personal Vita, I've even firmware hacked it, allowing me to download all sorts of things. There's even a version of HShop equivalent on the PS Vita that you can download and hack called PKG, but if I talk any more about that, Sony assassins will fall through my ceiling and gun me down. The actual experience of modding your PS Vita has gotten so much better since I originally did mine so many years ago. Back in my day, it took basically multiple hours of annoying Windows and USB, so many errors I experienced. It was an actual nightmare. But nowadays, it is as simple as scanning a QR code or opening a website in the Vita's network browser, and boom, the thing is now hacked. And there's some minor things you have to do to make it permanent, but the whole process takes like 15 minutes. So it is so much easier nowadays than it was back when I first did it 6 or 7-ish years ago now. When it comes to emulation, it does require you to hack your PS Vita, but as I mentioned before, it is a fairly simple process nowadays. And some of the things you can do with it in terms of emulation is basically maxing out about N64, but the primary thing you would want to emulate on this thing is PS1 and PSP, which have native support. You can access the PSP titles through something called Adrenaline, which is essentially an emulator, but it is running natively on the hardware instead of simulating PSP is, and uses a translation layer to basically convert it to run natively on the PS Vita, which is incredibly cool. And they made native ports of so many of the best PS1 games. It doesn't cover every single PS1 game, but pretty much any game you would want to even consider playing, you can. And you can convert normal PS1 ROMs into the version that is natively supported by the PS Vita, because PKG won't have everything available on that. To me, it is one of the best ways to play PS1 and PSP games, because some emulators on the lower end of things still aren't capable enough to do PS1 or PSP perfectly. And that's what the Vita offers. If you're a primarily Sony person and you're incredibly down or just really want the Sony experience, the Vita is still one of the best ways to emulate things like PSP and PS1 games. It's just a more native experience, and it just feels at home on the device. Like, sure, you can play Pokemon on the thing, but it doesn't feel right. When you play it on a 3DS, it feels at home, like it was always meant to be there, because it was. But if you are a huge fan of just emulating anything and everything on this device, like I mentioned before, when it comes to true actual emulation, it tops out about N64. It can play a lot of titles, but some titles also still won't work. Smash Brothers, I've never been able to get that game to properly run, but it could also be my crappy ROM. Games like Rayman 64 ran fine enough. Mario 64 ran with that issue, and same for Banjo and Kazooie, two of my favorite N64 games, so I'm pretty much covered when it comes to N64. I wouldn't really buy this thing for N64 emulation though. It's just not quite enough to really get the job done in that respect. But it can pretty much handle anything older than that. Super Nintendo, NES, Genesis, all the stuff you would possibly want from the 8 and 16-bit eras, it obviously covers. You can also do Dreamcast emulation, but I have personally never actually gotten it to work. I have seen people get it to work, but there's either something I've done wrong with my implementation, because every time I go back to try to get it to work, it just refuses to do so. It could also be my crappy ROMs, which honestly, now thinking about it, might be the case. I'll leave a blurb on screen now to tell you whether or not future me has fixed it, but if I didn't, I'll live. I'm not a huge Dreamcast guy to begin with, so I never really cared. Game Boy Advance is a system that I like to shout out as a particular favorite on this device. It is not by any means the exact aspect ratio, but setting it just to fill the screen to me has been one of my favorite ways to play Game Boy Advance, just because the larger screen is just a nice screen to begin with. So it just, to me, is one of my favorite ways to play Game Boy Advance games, and in the past, it has been one of my primary devices that I had played them on. Other devices around this similar price point are original 3DSs, budget devices from Anbernic and many other companies. I still think even amongst that competition, the Vita still holds a pretty decent position, at least value-wise. Like I said, especially if you're a huge PlayStation fan wanting PS1 and PSP games and native Vita games to run well in pretty much the best way you can portably. Honestly, it's one of the best ways to do so, and I could honestly recommend people purchase this device, which isn't the same conclusion that I had even last year. Still, even at that time, prices were not that good, but now you can even pick up the OLED version of the Vita for a pretty decent price. Alongside all the amazing things the community has done, genuinely, the Vita makes a pretty decent value proposition. What about you? Have you considered buying a Vita? Have you recently purchased one and you're just watching this video to validate your opinion? I know I do that. Leave a comment down below. I would love to hear what you guys think. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. All the other social media coverage down below. And last but not least, have a wonderful day.